I have the pleasure of we have Casey Babb as our keynote speaker. Casey Babb is a fellow at the John Laurie Institute and at the Institute for the Security of Studies in Tel Aviv. And Casey is going to give us a thorough analysis of work and the current events of contemporary anti-Semitism today. Casey, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be speaking with you today. A huge thanks to the organizers, to Matthew and Hadassah. You've been great. Can't thank you enough for putting this together. Um, Look, I mean, I don't need to tell you this. We've just obviously heard, very moving remarks that underscore the environment right now, the situation that we're up against. But we're clearly meeting during very um, concerning times, to say the least, and during what is, probably the most dangerous time for Jews. Um, since the end of the Second World War. And we're really at an inflection point right now where, um, uh, you know, things could go one way or another, not just for the Jewish world, but for the civilized one. So this is a very important event that you've put together today. And certainly the murders of Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram underscore, uh, the dangers that we face. And the same could be said for other recent acts of violence as well. The burning of Governor Shapiro's home on the first night of Passover, and the bombing of Jews in Boulder, Colorado, who, you know, were gathered to as a show of solidarity with other Jews who were attacked, who were kidnapped. Um, so, very, very dangerous times. What I'll be focusing on today um, is a form of hatred, a form of anti-Semitism, which right now most other um, um, forms of anti-Semitism, if that's how we want to think of it, are anchored to. Um, in which most of the hostilities that we face today are anchored to, and that is anti-Zionism. Um, and anti-Zionism, it's not just simply a type of anti-Semitism. You will hear people often argue whether it is or is not anti-Semitism. It's not just that. It is the dominant permission structure which has created an environment where the idea of erasing Jews and, in fact, killing them is not just normalized in many circles. It's become a righteous and a noble cause, a progressive one. And people are starting slowly to talk about these things and to wake up to these things. In speaking about anti-Zionism now, obviously hope to set the table for the rest of the discussions you'll be part of today, the rest of the speakers that you'll be listening to. But I also want to ensure you leave the event with a better understanding of what is now the most common and destructive form of anti-Semitism, um, and to leave you with some ideas that you can maybe use to arm yourself as you encounter anti-Zionism, and as you hopefully work to confront it in, your own circles, wherever it sort of appears. Now, if we're going to discuss anti-Zionism, we should first define Zionism. Um, Despite its weaponization and the frequency in which it is incorrectly used in a variety of ways, it's rather, to me at least, simply defined. Zionism is a movement for the liberation and self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. Um, I also personally consider Zionism to be a liberation movement that can serve as a sort of guide through life, but perhaps that's for another conversation. For now, I would just encourage people to think of Zionism as I've defined it, a movement for the liberation and self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. Anti-Zionism is a counterforce which is to actively delegitimize, undermine, weaken, and discredit any notion of Jewish self-determination in the Middle East. Um, its fundamental objective is to eventually see the collapse of the Jewish state. The loudest voices, the loudest anti-Zionists, they will tell you this. And simultaneously, they will often claim that their criticism is aimed at Israeli policies or Zionist ideology, not at Jews, not at a people or a religion. We're not anti-Semitic, they'll say. Uh, We're just opposed to Jews having any sense of self-determination and living in their ancestral homeland. Nothing more than that. Okay, so we know what Zionism is. We just parked that for a moment. Well, what is anti-Zionism and where does it come from? Some of you, I mean, it sounds like from based on questions and the remarks that were just given, most of you probably do have a general sense of where it comes from. Some of you, though, might be surprised to learn that it didn't emerge after the re-establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. It's actually much older than that, and it's been around for a very long time. And it has emerged through several distinct but complementary and mutually reinforcing ideological camps and movements. And so I'll start briefly with what is probably most important in terms of its origin, and we could debate that, and that is Soviet Russia. In Soviet Russia, from 1918 to 1920, Jewish sections of the Communist Party actually closed Zionist offices and banned Zionist literature across Soviet territories. And this was no accident. Communist doctrine actually held that Jews would be fully emancipated only through socialist revolution, not nationalist separatism. If you're going Jewish, you better be the right sort of Jew. And that some of that and some of, much of what I'm going to talk about going forward will probably sound familiar, will probably sound like things you're hearing today, even though I'm talking about things that are 100 years old or more. So don't go run off and try to create your own thing, something of your own. You're either with us or you're not. And Stalin's famous comrade Lenin said Zionism defined Zionism as a socially retrogressive and essentially a capitalist scheme that ignored class divisions among Jews. And so in that way, Zionism in Soviet Russia, in communist circles, was viewed as a counter-revolutionary movement. Zionists were counter-revolutionaries. Ironically, Stalin's early foreign policies were initially pro-Zionist. From late 44 to 48, he actually supported the creation of the State of Israel, recreation, I should say, hoping a new Jewish state would be socialist, and that in being socialist, it would weaken British influence, Western influence in the Middle East. And in fact, the USSR was one of the first countries to recognize Israel. But once Israel aligned with the US, abruptly changed tone and reverted to the pre-existing party line. And he actually launched an anti-Semitic campaign culminating in the 1953 Doctors' Plot and attacks on rootless cosmopolitans, which I'm sure you've heard before, aka Jews. And Zionism then was sort of recast or returned um, as an imperialist plot. So it's now being vilified again. And by the 1960s, so we're talking 15, 20 years after the reestablishment of the State of Israel, Khrushchev was officially and publicly condemning Zionism as a form of racism. And so when we're talking about these things, it's hard not to think about new things like anti-Palestinian racism and much of what we hear these days on Zionism. It's recycled. It's old. But Soviet anti-Zionist ideology was not confined to the USSR, clearly. Moscow actively promoted it in international arenas. And this is key when we're talking about anti-Zionism. In 1967 and 1975, between those years, I should say, Soviet diplomats and Allied leaders actually cast Israel as a colonialist state. Again, something you hear all the time, every day now. For example, at the 1975 UN Women's Conference in Mexico City, Soviet and Arab delegates successfully inserted Zionism alongside colonialism, apartheid, and racism in its final declaration, calling for the elimination to achieve peace, the elimination of Zionism, of the State of Israel. In the same period, the Organization of African Unity publicly linked the racist regime in occupied Palestine with South African apartheid and common imperialist origin. And at the Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Lima in 1975, delegates, delegates severely condemned Zionism as a threat to world peace. And so these multinational fora they really gave enormous legitimacy and credibility to the idea that Zionism was inherently bad, that it was evil, that it was a outgrowth of colonialism, that it was racism. Then we get to the peak. Sorry, another water break. Then we get to the peak in 1975. In November 1975, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 3379, which some of you may have heard of. It was sponsored by the Arab League. So now we're getting into the relationship between Arab anti-Zionists and communist Soviet anti-Zionists. It was sponsored by the Arab League and backed by the Soviet bloc, as well as many African states and numerous Muslim countries. And the resolution famously states that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. And that vote was 72 in favor and 35 against, with 32 abstained. This is a massive turning point and a huge Cold War victory for the Soviet Arab alliance. And in fact, at that time, Israelis in New York described feeling like pariahs on that day. And delegates actually celebrated what one witness described as the biggest victory of their lives. In practical terms, though, the resolution enshrined anti-Zionist ideology in the UN Charter. Again, we're talking about the UN, we're talking about anti-Semitism at the UN. We hear this all the time, but it's not a new phenomenon. So this anti-Zionist ideology is now enshrined in the UN Charter, broadly equating the Jewish state with racism. So that was actually rubber stamped and voted on. Even after 1975, of course, the rhetoric continued. Soviet journals and textbooks on Zionology defined Zionism as inherently aggressive and imperialistic. And in 1969, Yuri Ivanov, who you may have heard of, he was a leading Soviet Zionologist. He wrote that Zionism was the ideology of wealthy Jewish bourgeoisie allied with American imperialism. And in everyday life, the USSR actually severely restricted Jewish emigration, especially to Israel, as a way of punishing Zionist loyalties. And internationally, Moscow kept its diplomats and proxies constantly mouthing the same talking points, much of what we're today, over and over again. Zionism equals racism equals apartheid. And in fact, as late as 1989, I read one scholar actually said that Soviet anti-Zionism was still considered the greatest threat to Israel and Jews generally at that time. And of course, we'll talk about this later, but this has actually worsened in the time since. Um, that same scholar said that the anti-Zionist campaign survived the collapse of the Soviet system, which it did. And so while Soviet communism may have fallen, its anti-Zionist network and ideology and rhetoric far outlived it, influencing left-wing movements, Arab movements, Muslim movements around the world. Fast forward to the next sort of campaign that picks up where the Russians, where the Soviets, where the communists left off. And that's the BDS movement. In this post-Cold War era, a new movement has carried forward the goal of isolating Israel, the BDS movement. And it was launched 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, by over 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, calling on activists worldwide to, quote, impose broad boycotts on Israel, similar to those applied to South Africa in the apartheid era. Its slogans and tactics echo earlier anti-Zionist language and official BDS literature. It actually claims to oppose anti-Semitism, but the campaign's demands, of course, to end Israel's control over the West Bank and its emphasis on the right of return. By the way, there will be no right of return. We can talk about that later. Are naturally and obviously, rather obviously, seen as incompatible with Israel's existence as a Jewish state. So if you take the goals of BDS, if those were to be realized, it would actually mean that Israel no longer exists as a Jewish state. But again, that's not anti-Semitic. Unsurprisingly, most Jewish organizations, as you probably know full well, condemn BDS as anti-Semitic. And what BDS does is it publicly compares Zionism in Israel to colonialism, again, and apartheid. A repackaging of the Soviet era charge that Zionism is uniquely evil. And that's really what it boils down to. It is the be all end all of injustice and inequality. And now this anti-Zionist rhetoric, talking about Brock, but it's everywhere. It thrives on college campuses and in activist NGOs. Groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, they explicitly organize to dismantle Zionism and to challenge what they call Zionist hegemony in academia. Jewish Voices for Peace, a US-based organization, even bills itself as Jews against Zionism. To remind, there were groups of communist Soviet Jews who were anti-Zionists. In March 2025, the umbrella National Students for Justice in Palestine actually called for a mass walkout and takeover of campus spaces in the US, framing the students, the faculty, and the staff at the university as just resisting Zionism. These modern activists, as you all know, typically invoke the familiar, lexicon of anti-Zionism, accusing Israel of apartheid, likening Zionists to fascists, calling Israel's policies genocidal. I don't normally talk this much. Contemporary events illustrate how anti-Zionism persists. It's everywhere. During, the recent war in the Middle East since October 7th, protests around the world have blurred repeatedly into, anti-Semitic territory, even though it's described as anti-Zionism. Demonstrators have chanted slogans, shown banners, waved flags, calling for the end of the Zionist state, and supporting armed resistance. And social media campaigns, of course, have amplified these messages, uh, praising groups that seek Israel's destruction. But that's not uncommon. None of this is uncommon anymore. What I find actually uncommon is when I don't encounter these things. Notably, we were talking about the ADL. The 2024 ADL report found that the majority of anti-Semitic incidents today involve references to Israel and Zionism. And in the political sphere too, uh, international bodies continue to single out Israel. For instance, UNESCO some years ago granted Palestinian status to sites in Jerusalem and the West Bank, which clearly undermines and delegitimizes Israel's history. At the same time, many human rights and academic conferences, starting from the Durban Conference onward, have featured anti-Zionist resolutions. That Durban Conference on racism was, I'm sure some of you know about this, was widely condemned as being um, really infused with a level of anti-Semitism that was sort of unprecedented, at least in that space. And it revived, again, Zionism is racism, that theme. Uh, and it was so bad, it led US and Israeli delegates to walk out. And these examples really, and there's so many examples, they really show that the idea of Zionism um, as a uniquely evil movement or ideology, it really still resonates quite widely. It's still part of normal sort of global discourse. Um, so, all told, the history of anti-Zionism it's the story of a narrative, much like the people it seeks to delegitimize and in fact destroy, that has refused to die. It's stronger now than it ever was. It was born in Marxist dogma and it was nurtured by Soviet propaganda, and it grew through international political campaigns, and now it thrives in activist circles. And whether or not one agrees with Israeli government policies, I'm not here to get into that. It's really crucial for people to understand that, the lineage of anti-Zionism. And anti-Zionism today almost always carries the subtext of anti-Semitism, denying Jewish self-determination or demonizing an entire people. As Jewish scholar Anthony Julius notes, Israel and Jewish communities once hoped the 1975 Zionism is racism libel would fade away, but it hasn't. It has reemerged stronger than ever, and it's part of campus movements and global boycotts. And so, recognizing this history, it helps us draw a line between fair policy and criticism, as you would have with any sovereign country, and discriminatory rhetoric. And it reminds us that Zionism, for the Jewish people, it is not some abstract ideology. It is the basis of refuge. So when anti-Zionist campaigns insist Israel's very existence is illegitimate, well, it, you're seeing the invoking of tropes from centuries of anti-Jewish prejudice, which transcend political debate and don't just edge into hatred, but jump headfirst into it. And so by underscoring the roots of anti-Zionism, we can better identify when it serves really as a proxy, as a veil for anti-Semitism, and we can call it out accordingly, which we should be doing. And earlier I provided what I think is a clear and simple definition of Zionism, a movement for the liberation and self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. But I should also try to simplify anti-Zionism too. I've spelled it out a bit. I've traced its origins a bit, but I haven't quite boiled it down. And so this is how I think of anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is an ideological strategy and movement designed to undermine the last and only holdout, the last bastion, the last refuge of Jewish life. That's what it is. If Israel can be destroyed, finally, the Jews can be returned to their rightful and natural place socially and politically. And that is beneath others. And so, and we deal with this a lot in Canada, not so much in most other countries. But when we're here and we hear land acknowledgements, or we're told about things like colonialism or settler colonialism, that's my favorite. We're being exposed to ideas that don't lead anywhere. They don't lead to anything. What do they lead to? Visions of Vancouver or Halifax somehow being returned to a group of people that predates us, of there being some great correction. I mean, it's all frankly, it's absurd. But in the mind of the anti-Zionist, there is the belief in the possibility of undoing something that shouldn't have ever been realized in the first place, of relieving the world of all its sins and all its injustice and all its inequalities, of hitting the reset button on 1948, of getting a do-over. This is anti-Zionism. To the anti-Zionist, there is they people know that there's not going to be any correction in Canada, the US, or Australia. But people legitimately believe if they hang on and they work hard enough and they're loud enough and they're consistent, they could actually see these ideas materialize in Israel. And so what anti-Zionism has done is it's contributed to the complete inversion of reality, the erosion of truth, the complete manipulation of basic information. Even if the information is right in front of you, it doesn't matter to anti-Zionists and people who indulge anti-Zionism. Activists fed sandwiches on boats and sent packing on commercial flights. They're kidnapped. Uh, Defensive military campaigns are genocide, even though the population has increased in size, something that I don't believe has ever happened in any genocide in history. The distribution of literally millions of meals, that's an intentional famine. We're feeding you millions of meals, but we're also starving you at the same time. And journalists and reporters and UN personnel who participated in terrorist attacks, they are innocent civilians. And all of this is anchored to anti-Zionist ideology and the parasitic thinking that is anti-Zionism. And so what we must do going forward is to continue educating ourselves on the origins of anti-Zionism. You know, we're speaking with each other here. We get this stuff. Most people don't. Most people are worried about paying their mortgage or the price of gas or the political landscape domestically or daycare. They're not thinking about these things, but they're being exposed to a lot of it. And that's why we're seeing survey results like we saw earlier this week, where 50% of Canadians believe Israel is committing a genocide. We need to keep pushing back against this, and we need to take every opportunity to talk about and learn about the realities of this ideology of this campaign. And we need, to the best of our abilities, we need to take that information and use it to confront it. Whether it's in the a school board, or union meetings, or the workplace, or the classroom, or your backyard. We have to learn about these things, and we have to keep talking about them. Enemies of the Jewish people, enemies of the decent people of the civilized world, and others here, people, they will tell you the same thing. Phil Gursky will tell you the same thing. So will David Bernstein. They haven't stopped. They don't stop for a moment. Whether you're working at CSIS or you're working at a university in the US, watching these things, you know that they haven't stopped. And so we must not either. And I'll stop there, but I've spoken for 30 minutes. You've had enough of me by now, but I'd be delighted to take some questions if there are any.
Andrea?
Given the, can you hear us?
You have to speak a little bit to get to the microphone here.
Hi, Casey. Can you?
Yes.
Yeah. So my question is, given everything you've said, how do we operate in the current political environment where we have a federal government increasingly pushing all of the negative stereotypes and all of false information?
Well,
That was when,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I was fearful that this government was going to be more of a problem for the Canada's Jewish community than the last one, and it feels like that's the case in some ways. And I've said this repeatedly to people. I think a lot of it has to come. It comes down to the fact that Prime Minister Carney is viewed by a lot of people as more legitimate, a more serious guy, a more serious prime minister than Trudeau. So you'd say the exact same things, or even less of the same stuff, but it seems like it's taken more seriously. You go, oh, he's got a PhD from Oxford. He's a published author. He looks the part. He's the former governor of the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England. If he says something, I mean, it must be true. So we are dealing with that, absolutely. I think we need to, the only thing that we can do, or one of the only things that we can do, is keep countering what comes out, which is incorrect, what needs to be said. We're trying to do that at MLI. I know other organizations are trying to do that too. It's really a lot of whack-a-mole. If it's not, one thing, it's another. Um, it's this statement that came out that Canada signed on to, saying that they don't support, that Canada doesn't support increased military operations in Gaza. It's insane. But we have to come out immediately and try to counter that. Our Jewish organizations need to do a better job of coming out forcefully against these things. They are really, wet noodles when it comes to a lot of this. They're really inefficient, and yet they continue to receive millions of dollars. So our Jewish organizations need to do a better job. I think people need to it's easier said than done. Not be so hesitant, not be concerned about what the repercussions could be if they speak out. I think we have to speak out. Um, and we need to try to get out of these echo chambers. The echo chambers are killing us. They're great in strengthening our own awareness of things and our own understanding of things, but we need to tap into other communities. Because a lot of these communities, a lot of people, I think, would be very receptive and sympathetic to what we're going through.
And can I just follow up with that? Two things I think are impeding us. First of all, the other media, other than the National Post, won't get our story out even if you tell them. Even if you send them press releases, they don't want to know and they won't report it. And secondly, you have a government besides Carney that is full of ministers who have huge influence or totally stupid, like our foreign minister. And
Yeah.
we have 17 members of the government who supported the Vote Palestine platform.
Yeah.
So is our government not catering to basically the enemies of Israel? They have a huge vote in this country.
Yeah, it certainly feels like that. And I mean, God, you have the Minister of Public Safety. Most Canadians wouldn't even know this, though, right? You have the Minister of Public Safety recusing himself from files dealing with two terrorist organizations because of a potential conflict of interest. I mean, so a lot of this stuff is happening, like I said, where I don't think it's getting the attention of people. To us, it's huge. A Toronto District School Board motion on anti-Palestinian racism. That's big news in the Jewish community. Um, Anita Anand saying something in the House of Commons about the weaponization of food. To us, we hear that. That's a big thing. Most people don't hear that. Most people have no idea that these things are said. If I brought things up, they would have. We're not going to be able to change what Anita Anand is saying or Mark Carney or anyone else in the government. We might be able to sort of steer them in a bit of a different direction, but we need to expose other people and get more people on our side to the realities of the situation. And I think through that, cumulatively, over time, years and years and years, you could see an improvement.
Casey, I have a question. You say that we have to get out of our bubbles and our echo chambers, and I absolutely agree with that. And but I'm not quite sure exactly how you need to do that. Are you talking about interfaith alliances? What actually are you talking about?
I mean, it could be, I think we all have a role in it, right? It could be, me inviting over uh, a colleague who's not Jewish, who doesn't know about these things, over a conference with 500 attendees from the Christian community. It could be writing a paper with a Muslim Arab partner. It could be any of these sorts of things. I think there's no one right way to go about it. It could be interfaith dialogue. It could be just interpersonal connections and relationship building with people around you, with your neighbors. Um, we're trying to do all this at MLI. It's why I try to do media in other countries. I'm speaking with, I mean, they're an ally of Israel, so it's not like I'm speaking with media in Iran. I'm changing minds there. But I'm doing an interview later today with one of the larger outlets in Azerbaijan. We're producing content at MLI in Arabic. We're having people on like Ahmed Al-Khatib onto the podcast, or Loai Al-Sharif, or um, uh, you know, a variety of other folks. Um, it's all of it. I think it's all of it. We all have a part to play, whether we're a major consulting firm or an individual just on the street, or we're an academic or whatever. If we just keep talking about these things amongst ourselves, it's not gonna improve.
Um, so I had a question relating to that. Uh, so as I said before, that the research of prejudice hasn't focused on. Yeah, so we don't know much about how anti-Jewish prejudice works from an empirical perspective. We do so little research on it, but I know that like in other prejudice research, it shows that knowledge, like it's not beliefs about the outgroup that drives the prejudice. It's the feelings, which I'm sure are influenced by some of the outgroups. But even by showing evidence, by showing the story, it doesn't shift um, the prejudice. What does in other prejudices, and I don't know yet what it looks like in this. Um, it's things like empathy building, perspective taking, group contact. Uh, what's your sense? Because I'm here, and I'm a person that really believes that education and knowledge really our information out and our side of the story and our history and everything that's around it. But I'm afraid that again we're gonna have so much effort and in the same place. Um, yeah, if we don't do things based on what we know the other prejudices.
Yeah.
You were in and out a little bit there. Were you essentially saying that, in doing some of the things that we've been talking about, it might not make a difference? Was that your concern?
Yeah, that it may be. I mean, maybe it's important, maybe it's empowering for us, like to know the truth in the Jewish community, like to kind of empower the victims, even though that's not how we want to identify ourselves. But in terms of changing the anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist attitudes, do you really think that more knowledge will influence the trend, direction, perhaps, um, than maybe other?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a combination of things, right? I'm trying to remain optimistic. I'm being honest with you. With others on the line. I'm not just talking about Jews. I'm talking about our way of life. Other days I feel I'll see something or I'll hear something and I'll go, oh, okay. Maybe there's something to work with there. I'm having one of those days. So I think a lot of this movement seems to be really irritating um, much of the general population. I think people on Bay Street are probably getting tired of seeing large groups of men praying in public when they go to work or when they're trying to leave work. I think people at Union Station are probably tired of having their travel disrupted um, because of pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian protesters. I think people in downtown Ottawa don't really love seeing men dressed up like Hamas terrorists. So I think if we keep doing our part and they keep failing and agitating the general population, and we keep sort of telling the story, which I think needs to be told, people need to see themselves in the issues of others, in the trauma of others, you know. And so if we keep telling people, showing people that this is not a Jewish issue, this is about our, you know, the integrity of everything that we've built, everything that we've created for ourselves generationally, for ourselves and for our families in Canada. I think people are waking up to that and they're really going, oh, this is a problem. Maybe we can change immigration policies. Maybe we can create some bubble zones. Maybe we can change the way people protest. What, what is deemed incitement, what is not. All these sorts of things, I like to believe cumulatively will turn the tide a bit in time.
Yeah. So my name is Jim Doherty. I'm with the Niagara Military Museum, and we're one of the sponsors of this, small event. And I'm coming from the World War II perspective. We commemorate the military history of Canadians and such. And we sent 1.1 million across to fight this. And I think I was hoping we'd shot enough of those sons of bitches and hung enough of them and stuck enough of them in prison that we kind of stamped this out. And I find it shocking that it's so virulent, and coming back so forcefully. I'd like to say, though, I think just using the term anti-Semitism does not capture the spirit of what is going on.
Yeah.
I think it needs to change to Jew hatred or hatred of Jews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay? Like, let's stop using euphemisms. It doesn't have the power. It's just anti-Semitism. Okay, well, I just don't like them. No, this is hatred of people. And if it can exist against Jews, then it can exist against, other people, groups in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. To your point, again, I keep saying this sort of stuff. The average person doesn't know what anti-Semitism is. I mean, polls suggest just in the US, I mean, most people really have no even understanding of the Holocaust. It's insane. So, and yet at the same time, they're being exposed relentlessly to mis and disinformation, to hateful rhetoric. A lot of it's not even carried out by humans anymore on social media. So yeah, you're right. We have to find a way to uh, reach people because you're right. I don't think we're doing a particularly good job. Um, and I don't think people understand the impact all of this is having on Canada or Canadians. My colleague Alan Kessel, and I helped him with the piece. It's on the front of the National Post today, I think, hard copy, and it's online. Where are the protests about Judy Weinstein? Most people in this country wouldn't even know that name. Um, this is a Canadian who was murdered. Um, I posted recently on social media, and I've talked about her before, but Adi Vital Kaplan, Canadian. Her mother was down the street from me while Adi was being murdered in front of her children in Israel. Um, this isn't resonating with people. They're not getting it. And I think for a lot of people who are getting it, they think of it's been so normalized that they just see it as sort of a natural. This is part of the natural world. It's like the sky being blue and the sun being hot. It's why I think you run into that knee-jerk reaction when people say, or you could be talking about anti-Semitism. People go, yeah, and Islamophobia too. They pair them as these forever ideas that are connected, that are just natural and to be expected. So one of the things, yes, we have to stop using anti-Semitism.
I come from two different backgrounds, and there's my pre-Jewish life and my now Jewish life. And I grew up in a neighborhood where one of the girls in our neighborhood, she was the girl. This is like years ago. She was involved in that bomb on the beach in Tel Aviv. Yeah. Arnie. That's right. So I think the important part is to touch upon this. Maybe not so much going against the anti-Semitism because we are going against people who are being funded, who are being greatly paid by a lot of money put into this. But maybe if we could concentrate a little more on the people who are neutral, who are uneducated about this. I was one of those. I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood, and I used to say, I hate Israel. I met an Israeli soldier in Toronto, and she said, "Why?" I said, "Why?" I don't know. It's just something I heard. I heard
Yeah,
like half my school was
yeah,
Jewish, the other half wasn't, and maybe if we could concentrate more on organizations like I did Hasbara. I learned a lot in Hasbara. I learned about Israel. I learned about Judaism, and not so much Hillel, where it's like a safe space. Safe spaces are great, but we need organizations that are educated in generation in universities, but also reaching out to the non-Jewish community. Because if you're influencing those people who are neutral or who just don't care too much and they're learning more and they're helping us spread the news. This is what I'm trying to do with my social media. Eventually, you reach the other side that has a lot of hatred against us. It's easier to do that than go directly against people who are being paid millions of dollars to come and not
yeah,
work,
yeah,
protest in the streets.
yeah. Well,
You never know, but I mean, it's good to start with. You have the people who hate it, have the people who are neutral and uneducated, and then you have us. Why not start with
well, to your point, the survey that I mentioned not long ago about 50% of Canadians thinking that Israel is committing genocide. One of the other big findings in that, which won't, it's not going to get any attention, right? The attention, what's been flagged on CTV or Global News is the 50%, not the fact that, 30 to 40% of respondents didn't know what to think and had no opinion on the survey questions. Um, that's a huge number of people. That's millions of Canadians. That represents millions. So I see that as an opportunity. So if we stay motivated and try to reach these people in new ways more consistently, I think we'll achieve some things.
I have one last question, Casey, and I guess I feel when I look at the UK or France that they passed their tipping point here,
Yeah, I have.
and I want to know whether you think we're at the tipping point or past the tipping point here in Canada.
I don't hear the answer to that. That's frightening answer.
Um, I can tell you somebody, I recently sat down with this very senior Israeli official, and they told me that in their view, Canada is 10 years behind, 10 years away from being France or the UK. Um, I don't know whether to agree with that or not. Um, I think if a silent majority, if that really is such a thing, which I like to believe it is, if the silent majority stays silent, we're probably going to be past the tipping point here pretty soon. But if we can mobilize people um, and change some policies, namely things like immigration, um, we might be in a better situation in 5 or 10 years than we thought otherwise.